President Paulson sat at the head of the medium-sized mahogany conference table that was in his office with his top aide, Mr. Bill King, who sat next to him to his left. The president seemed to be in a jovial mood as his aide told him about the recent bombings by the CPAC via the TCAP. That's all the information that I have for you right now, sir. The short, balding aide set down his stack of papers on his lap and folded his hands. Keeping all expression from his face, he looked at President Paulson and waited for a response. The president smiled and took a deep breath. Good information, Mr. King. President Paulson leaned forward towards Mr. King and smiled almost hypnotically. Tell me, have there been any more bombing since the initial bombings 3 weeks ago? Mr. King adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat, and without realizing it, he smiled back at the president. No, sir, I am happy to say that as far as our information tells us, there have been no further bombings or attacks on the major cities infiltrated with TOR members. President Paulson slammed his fist down hard on the mahogany table. Happy? You're happy to report that there have been no more attacks by the CPAC? Mr. King got a little nervous and picked up and shuffled the papers from his lap and then set them down on the table. I can check my information and sources again, sir. His stomach turned as he realized that he forgot to hide his true feelings from the president and monitor his words carefully. He looked at the president timidly and repeated, I can check my information and sources again, sir. Mr. King's voice shook as he spoke softly. The president said gruffly, No. Mr. King withheld all emotion from his face by forcing his mind to ignore his true feelings about the president. President Paulson looked carefully at Mr. King. Was he a traitor? Paulson opened his mouth to say something, paused for a moment, and then took a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair. As he spoke, he toned down his voice from a controlled rage to a syrupy, sweet tone. No, don't bother checking, Mr. King. I know that your stats are always impeccable and well-researched. President Paulson rested his left hand against the side of his face with his index finger reaching to his temple. He lightly tapped his index finger against his temple, as though it helped him to think. It was a habit that only his staff had noticed. And although his voice remained controlled when he spoke, his face still had a reddish tone that was present when he was quite angry. His red face was quite a contrast to his graying black hair. Leave those documents with me, Mr. King. President Paulson leaned forward and pointed toward blank papers that Mr. King was once again holding. You may go back to your office now. Yes, sir. Mr. King handed the documents to President Paulson and quietly left the room. President Paulson looked at the information again and scowled. He stood up abruptly and took the papers over to his desk and sat down. He set the papers down on his rich mahogany wood desk and leaned back in his large, comfortable black leather chair. He folded his arms and lightly rocked his chair forward and back. He stared at the wall across the room as though he were watching a movie. A few minutes later, President Paulson leaned forward and rested his forearms on his desk and took another look at the documents. A look of anger arose upon his expression that turned so dark that his face looked contorted. He crumpled the papers in his hands into an unrecognizable wad and stared straight ahead again. His gaze was almost catatonic and lasted for several minutes before his trance was finally broken. He smiled a mischievous smile and became relaxed in his chair. As he leaned back, he smiled again. His eyes seemed to flash brightly for a moment as he thought of a brilliant plan to restart the fighting between the CPAC and TOR. His eyes glowed an amber yellow for a moment and then returned to their normal dark brown color. Paulson turned his swivel chair so that he was facing toward his right. He held a crumpled ball of papers in the palm of his left hand and held his right hand over the small, dark gray metal trash can that sat next to his desk. He grinned wildly and stared at the ball of paper intently. His eyes once again glowed an amber yellow, but far brighter this time. Within moments, the paper slowly started to smolder in his hand and then caught fire. He held onto it for a moment and then smiled sinisterly as he casually dropped the burning papers into the trash can and watched them burn. President Paulson wiped the ash from his hand on a black handkerchief that he retrieved from the left inside pocket of his black suit jacket. The flames had not harmed him. He smirked and placed the handkerchief on the left side of his desk. He leaned forward to rest his hands on the center of his desk for a moment before picking up the phone. Mr. King tapped lightly on the closed door to the president's office. He waited for a response. The president hit the intercom button. "Come in." Mr. King shivered as he heard the president's voice next to his ear through the intercom speaker. He slowly opened the door. The president seemed to be in a jovial mood. Mr. King kept silent, gave the president a small, pretty smile, and approached his desk. The president glanced at the paper that Mr. King was holding in his left hand. "What is this?" Mr. King cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that I have some bad news, sir." President Paulson took the document from Mr. King, and before he looked at it, his demeanor changed. His tone of voice became tense. "You may be dismissed, Mr. King." "Thank you." Mr. King nodded, and he headed towards the door at such a fast pace that he looked as though he were speed walking. He clumsily opened the door, exited, and closed the door behind him as quickly as he could. He did not want to be within 10 feet of the door when the president read the information that was in the document. The secret meeting. Several days later, in the middle of the day, President Paulson and 4 of his men from the Specialized Military Unit were meeting in a field under a grove of trees in a wilderness park area about 30 miles southeast of Los Angeles and 25 miles northeast of South City. They were all wearing black suits, white dress shirts, and black military boots. Each man wore a small rectangular red pin on their left lapel. President Paulson looked at one of the SMUA Specialized Military Unit agents that was standing to his left. At 6'3", the man was the tallest of the 4 men, with light blonde hair that was cut in a short military crew cut. Paulson was about to say something to the man, but decided to look at the road that they had just traveled on before saying anything. Once he saw that the road was empty, with no vehicles in sight, he looked at the agent again. "What time will he be here, Bob? I cannot stand here by this car under the trees all day. We have been here for 30 minutes. I don't tolerate being kept waiting." President Paulson looked at his watch and then crossed his arms. "Are we early, or is he late?" Agent Mike Plum, who was 34 years of age and of medium build, was known to be a man who was very loyal to the president and was very devoted to his job. He was meticulous and wanted everything to be perfect and to run smoothly. Agent Plum took off his sunglasses to look at his watch. His turquoise eyes were almost translucent. "We were 15 minutes early, sir. We were to meet him at 11 a.m. He is almost 15 minutes late now, sir." Plum put his dark sunglasses back on as his eyes were slightly sensitive to sunlight, something that he had always been able to hide from the president, who required perfection of all his SMU agents. Before President Paulson could say anything else, a large white unmarked box truck came into view from over the horizon. One of the other men, Agent Neil Jones, 42 years of age, also medium build, but shorter than the others at 5 foot 10 inches, with thick, dark brown, wavy hair, dark brown eyes, and a small, well-groomed mustache, pointed at the far horizon of the road and spoke up. "There's a white truck coming this way, sir," Agent Jones said in a calm manner. "I can see that, Mr. Jones." The president did nothing to hide his annoyance at Agent Jones. Agent Jones' face turned red. "Yes, sir. My apologies." He took a step back as if to hide. The men waited in silence for the truck to approach the area and park adjacent to President Paulson's black limo. A short, overweight man named Leonard Burns, who was in his late 40s with gray eyes and unruly dark brown hair, got out of the driver's side of the box truck. He was holding a clipboard with papers on it, and he had a cigar in his mouth. He wore a white t-shirt and a white baseball cap that barely fit his head, making his curly hair stick out even more. He had on dark gray slacks and wore dirty tan boots. He glanced at the men and then spoke up. His voice was gruff. "I've got your order, Mr. President." Leonard pulled a small stack of papers, which were 4 pages stapled together, off the clipboard and held the papers out in front of him. "I've got 4 coordinates here for delivery, as requested." President Paulson snickered. "Is that what they're calling them these days?" He winked and smiled at Leonard sinisterly. Leonard smiled back, oblivious to President Paulson's evil intent behind his sinister smile. Agent Plum took the papers from the driver and looked at them before handing them to President Paulson. "Everything seems to be in order, sir." The president looked the papers over briefly and then handed them back to Agent Plum while Leonard went back to the back of the truck and opened the white painted metal roll-up door. Once the door was opened completely, Leonard pulled down the metal plank that went from the truck to the ground, which he walked slowly up, as though he was climbing up the side of a steep mountain. He quickly opened 4 tall crates with a crowbar. He stood next to one of the coordinates, pointed at it, and looked at the group of men below. "You want me to unload these unactivated, or should I switch them on?" he asked. President Paulson gave another sinister smile to Leonard. "Activate them, but put them in standby mode. You may activate them in the truck to save yourself from keeping them in the crates and using a hand truck." After several minutes, all the coordinates were activated and in standby mode. Leonard looked at President Paulson. "Do you want a call command list for these guys?" President Paulson glared and spoke with a slow and deliberate tone. "No, I know what all of the commands are." He looked at the coordinates and said, "Bene Sate, come here." The coordinates, who were all dressed in black suits with white dress shirts and black dress shoes, walked down the plank slowly with purpose, and out, one after the other, until all 4 were standing in front of President Paulson. Agent Jones' mouth dropped open and he whispered aloud to himself, "They look like the governors of—" He stopped himself short of finishing the sentence when he noticed that Agent Plum had turned around and glared at him. Agent Jones could hardly believe that Agent Plum, who was at least 12 feet from him, was able to hear him. He had spoken just below a normal whisper. President Paulson walked around the coordinates and looked them over briefly and smiled with satisfaction. "They will do." Paulson looked at Leonard. "Remember to tell no one what you have seen." Paulson gave Leonard a look that could peel the paint off of a wall. "You may be dismissed." Leonard got a momentary look of fear and nodded to the president. He bit harder on his cigar as he hurried back to his truck, closed the back of the truck, and got into the driver's seat and drove off without saying a word. Agent Plum, along with another of President Paulson's men, Agent Rick Fields, who was 6 foot tall, 52 years old, with red hair and blue eyes, opened the center doors of the limo. Agents Plum and Fields stood on each side of the limo, which was an extra long stretch limo and had a double back seat, as well as a double center seat. President Paulson looked at Agent Plum. "Agent Plum, we will fully activate the coordinates when we get back to the facility and they have been checked out thoroughly." The president looked at the group of coordinates and spoke in a loud command. "Bene Sate, get into the car." The group of coordinates did as they were ordered and walked over to the limousine and got in. Their eyes, while they looked real, had a glassy look to them. President Paulson followed close behind them and stood next to the limo. He knew that once they were powered on completely, their eyes would look like every other human's eyes. Agent Plum stood close to the president and talked to him quietly for a few minutes. While the coordinates were getting into the car, the 4th agent who was present, Agent Frank Fisher, pulled Agent Neil Jones aside and spoke as softly as he could. "Jones, if you want to stay alive, you need to keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me? Look, Neil, we have known each other for a long time, and I do not want to see anything bad happen to you. Get it?" Agent Jones looked shaken but nodded his head. "I can't believe that I messed up," he said as he looked at his friend. "You know me, Frank. I always keep my mouth shut, even when I'm in field duty." Dr. Kahlo peered into the open door of the limo and looked at the coordinates. He looked back at the president and smiled. "These are fine specimens. They will do nicely, but I will certainly test out every facet of them." President Paulson took a step closer to the scientist and spoke at a low volume. "I need them by the end of the month. As you know, they will be taking over for the governor's positions in California, Utah, Oregon, and Washington State. Then once they have proven themselves, we will go on from there. Make sure to turn off their auto-update sectors. We don't need them getting a mind of their own and taking over." President Paulson laughed. A quiet but deep laugh, and smiled deviously. "Brilliant, Mr. President. Absolutely brilliant," Dr. Kahlo laughed. Then turned and spoke the alert command to the coordinates, which automatically went into sleep mode after 5 minutes when they were on standby mode. Bene Sate, alert! Bene Sate, follow me. The coordinates got out of the limousine and silently followed Dr. Paulo. Before Frank could say anything, they heard the buzzer that meant that the door behind them was being accessed. Both agents turned to look as two SMU field agents walked through the door and stood just past the doorway. Agent Jones recognized them both. The man on the left was a dark-skinned man of African descent and was 38 years old and 6 foot 4 inches tall. He had big, dark brown eyes and a smooth-shaved head. His name badge was attached to the left pocket of his well-pressed field uniform, which was a black military uniform with a red stripe down the outside of both pant legs. The name badge was blue and displayed the name Lieutenant Austin Miller. Austin was very muscular and of medium-large build. The man on the left was 39 and 6 foot 1 inches tall. He had sandy blonde hair and blue eyes. He had pale skin and was of average build. He was also wearing a field uniform, with his name badge clipped to his left front uniform pocket, displaying the name of Sergeant Philip Adams. Lieutenant Miller looked directly at Agent Jones. Agent Neil Jones, come with us. Neil's heart started pounding as he did his best to hide the look of fear on his face. He felt like all of the blood drained from his body. He had hoped that he had more time. He did not even have a chance to call and talk to Elizabeth one last time. He knew that he was a marked man, but he did not know that he would be taken care of at the facility and so soon. He took a shallow breath and answered the lieutenant, "Yes, sir." He walked gravely toward the men. He was careful to not look back at Agent Fisher so that the men would not get suspicious that he knew anything about what was happening, although there was a slight possibility that they had already suspected. He was hoping still that President Paulson thought nothing of his and Agent Fisher's earlier conversation. Agent Fisher looked on helplessly, making sure to show absolutely no emotion as he watched his friend being taken away. He watched for a moment and then turned and faced the limousine. The men took Agent Jones down the main corridor into the brass elevator. All Neil could do was think of his wife Elizabeth and their unborn daughter, and to remind himself to breathe. He felt faint and sick to his stomach. He had always been a little less tough than the other SMU men, but he thought that he was made of more than this. It was anguishing to feel such deep fear, knowing what was going to happen to him. Every fiber of his being wanted to fight and flee, but there was no way of escape now. He could never fight off Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams and escape the facility. All three of the men had been in the SMU agency together, and Field Agent Lieutenant Austin Miller kicked his butt every time. And while Field Agent Sergeant Philip Adams wasn't an exceptionally strong man, he was far stronger than Neil, and the only time that Neil had ever beat him in fighting and wrestling matches at the academy was by outwitting him with his mind, not out of physical strength. The elevator finally arrived at the main floor and the three men got in. Sergeant Adams pressed the elevator button for basement level 3, which was the farthest floor underneath the building. No one spoke a word or looked at each other. After what seemed to be an eternity to Neil, the elevator stopped, the doors opened, and the three men got off the elevator. Sergeant Adams pushed the door open, and he, Lieutenant Miller, and Agent Jones walked through the doorway and into another long hallway that led to a large, dark warehouse. The warehouse was wider in length than in width, and had row after row of metal supply shelves filled with boxes, canned food, and other supplies. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams led Neil to the very last row of shelves and stopped. The warehouse was eerily quiet. Neil was deep in thought about his family and too numb to feel afraid anymore, although his breathing was still labored. He thought about his latest mistake and all of the little things that he seemed to have done to irritate President Paulson over the past several weeks. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams changed positions from standing next to Neil to standing directly in front of him. Lieutenant Miller stepped close to Neil, too close. Lieutenant Miller's nose was almost touching Neil's forehead as Lieutenant Miller bent down to say something to him. Neil looked up. He looked squarely at Lieutenant Miller. Fear started to fill his mind again, and his heart started to race faster. He kept silent. He refused to show any fear. He wondered how it was going to be done. Would they end his life with a quickly broken neck? Or with a gunshot? No, that was too messy, Neil thought to himself. Listen carefully. Lieutenant Miller spoke, and then stepped away and went to the shelf to his right and bent down. He reached his hand to the back of the shelf and pulled out something blue and pressed it to Neil's chest. "Put this on." Neil looked confused. "What is it?" Lieutenant Miller answered, making sure to keep his voice down. "It's a TCAP pilot's uniform. It is fire retardant. Just in case." Neil looked at Lieutenant Miller and then the uniform and then back at Lieutenant Miller again. "Just in case of what? I do not understand. I thought that you were sent to kill me." Neil took the uniform. "Are you going to kill me in this wrinkled thing?" He held up the crumpled uniform and pressed it against Lieutenant Miller's chest. Lieutenant Miller looked serious. "Sure, Agent Jones. That way we can say that you were a TCAP pilot working for CCAP and you broke in here so we had cause to kill you." Neil nodded and looked at Lieutenant Miller's chest. Lieutenant Miller laughed. "Would you just trust me to put the darn suit on? We are trying to save your life here. Hurry up, man. The supply truck will be here any minute. Just put it over your own clothes. No one is bothering the CPAC or TCAP right now. If anyone in the public sees you in that pilot's uniform, they will leave you alone, unless you come across a tour member. Then you had better fight like hell." Lieutenant Miller laughed again. "Ha." Neil's fear turned into astonishment and then to giddiness. He took his boots off and slipped into the suit and zipped it up. "Why a pilot's uniform? I don't know how to fly a plane or a helicopter." Neil sat down on the ground. While he was sitting on the ground putting his boots back on, Lieutenant Miller explained. "A TCAP pilot's uniform was the only CPAC uniform that we could get. You are one lucky dog that Philip and I got the orders to kill you, not someone else." Philip smiled. Neil looked up at Austin and Philip. "You two are putting yourselves in a lot of danger doing this for me." Neil finished tying his boots and stood up. Philip looked at Neil and smiled. "I guess that we can trust you, since I'm sure that you will no longer be loyal to the SMU or to the president. Austin and I are undercover agents for an elite group that banded together a month after President Paulson took office. We are all ex-military men. We were called into action by former President Sayers." Austin added, "Sayers knew something was not right about Paulson and got this group together." Neil looked at Austin. "I need to tell you guys what I saw today, the reason that I was to be terminated." Austin smiled. "I was hoping that you would have some information for us." He glanced over at Philip and then back at Neil. "And as you know, this warehouse is unmonitored. We made sure to black out all the cameras that used to be active in here so we can speak freely. I have suspicions that President Paulson is an android. I think that my partner Frank Fisher does too, only he is smart enough to keep his mouth shut. You've seen the way that Paulson's eyes glow an amber color when he is angry, haven't you?" Austin nodded. "We have," Philip spoke calmly. "We all had our suspicions of that too, as well as Sayers. We have not figured out if Paulson is acting alone or if a person or persons are behind him, though. Sayers never said anything during the elections because he wanted to stay alive. But when Vice President Rich had that unfortunate accident shortly after Paulson took office, he decided to take some action. What kind of man kills off his own vice president?" "Man?" Austin laughed. "More like android." Austin looked directly into Neil's eyes. "It is on the down low that Sayers knows anything about this. We need to keep him alive. He can take temporary office when we get rid of Paulson." Neil looked at Philip and Austin. "You haven't heard the worst of it. He just picked up a shipment today and brought it here to the lab." "Hey, how are you going to explain my body disappearing?" "Man, you should know me by now. What did they call me in the academy?" Austin pointed to his own chest. "The Answer Man," Neil smiled. "That's right, I am the Answer Man. I always have a solution to every problem and an answer to everything." Austin grinned as he spoke in an even lower tone than he was speaking before, to spare Greg from the gruesome details. "We have a third KAIA man here at this facility. His name is Jerome Santos. He comes from a nice Puerto Rican family and he is very trustworthy. He made a dummy body. He wheeled it into the green room in the wheelchair, shot it, and then wheeled it into the trash room. He burned it up in the incinerator. He did a great job making it look like you, and he did it in less than 15 minutes. Austin looked at Neil and continued. "He used your ID image and printed out a rubber mask and used a wig that was in the trunk that he used to use as a disguise before. He used to work in the movies doing special effects. Anyone looking at camera footage or if anyone passing by caught sight of him and your double, no one would be the wiser. In fact, knowing Agent Santos, I am sure that he had witnesses so that everyone would know that you were properly taken care of. Austin smiled at Neil. You owe him a suit, by the way. I'm Sergeant Cooper. He held out his hand over his desk and shook Frank's hand. He continued, I understand, Agent Fisher, that your partner was Agent Neil Jones? Frank thought quickly, and the word was seemed to echo in his mind. Was? I'm sorry, I thought that someone had told me Agent Jones had an unfortunate accident. He was throwing something away in the incinerator and fell in. Frank almost threw up. He grabbed onto the chair arms. He knew that Neil did not have an accident. He believed the part about the incinerator and Neil ending up there, though. Frank had hoped that Neil had been dead before being thrown in it. Frank leaned back in his chair and clenched his teeth. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth that he would throw up. Was his friend alive and conscious when they threw him in? Or was he just knocked unconscious? Frank's thoughts tormented him. Frank leaned forward for a moment but was unable to speak and leaned back in his chair again and stared blankly at the sergeant. He could not talk, even if he had tried. Frank felt the tears sting his eyes, but he held them back very well, and he was almost certain that Sergeant Cooper could not tell, or so he thought. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank. I'm sorry. I know how close we can get to our military partners. Frank felt beyond ill. He looked around the office and noticed a water cooler in the front corner that he had not seen when he came in. He knew that Neil would be terminated, but being terminated so violently had never entered his mind. Frank finally was able to gain some composure enough to speak. Do you mind if I get some water? If you stay seated. I will get it for you. Sergeant Cooper got up and took a paper cup and filled it with cool water and handed it to Frank. Frank took a few sips. Thank you. He rested the cup on his lap to help hide the fact that his hands were shaking. Sergeant Cooper went back to his chair and sat down. I have some questions for you, Agent Fisher. Are you up to it, or do you need a few more minutes? Frank took another sip of water. I'm fine. Fire away. Sergeant Cooper looked at his clipboard. I see that you have quite an extensive background in government service. Frank nodded. He felt numb. Yes, sir. Have you ever thought of serving as a field agent for the SMU? Frank looked at Sergeant Cooper. He felt confused. He thought that he was going to be interrogated about his conversation with Neil earlier. No, sir, I haven't, to be honest. Your name came up in a meeting today with the president. He highly recommended you for a special assignment that we need extra men on. He has allowed me to release you of your duty to him and to join us. That was very kind of him, Frank looked at the sergeant. I would be honored. Frank still felt a gnawing suspicion in his gut. He did not trust President Paulson and wondered if he were being sent on a dangerous mission where he would be killed in the line of duty to help explain the sudden deaths of 2 SMU agents. Frank pushed back all thoughts of Neil. He needed to focus. We have a briefing at 1500 today in the Marks room. I will have a Corporal Faith bring you to your new quarters and provide you with a uniform. Frank was momentarily grateful that he did not have any family waiting for him at his apartment. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank. What do you know about ants, Agent Fisher? Ants, sir? Yes, ants. Frank sat back in his chair, still holding his water cup on his lap. I know that they crawl all over everything. They do, but specifically I'm talking about scout ants. Sergeant Cooper watched Frank's expression carefully. Scout ants, sure. They are the ones that go out a few at a time to check things out for their colony. Sergeant Cooper smiled. Very good, Special Agent Frank Fisher. Frank raised an eyebrow. Special Agent, sir? That is your new title. Sergeant Cooper leaned back in his chair, smiled, and folded his arms. Tell me, Special Agent Fisher, what's really going on? He leaned forward and put his elbows on his desk. Frank knew better than to trust anyone. I don't know what you mean, Sergeant Cooper. Frank kept a poker face on. He was almost sure this was a test or a trap. That was old school. Get someone's favor, make them feel comfortable with you, like you are an instant buddy or comrade. Then the trap is set. For one, you have been friends with Agent Jones for quite some time. Tell me, Special Agent Fisher, does Agent Jones seem the type that would be so clumsy as to fall into an incinerator? Sergeant Cooper gave a crooked smile that appeared to be a half smile and a half frown. Frank could not read Sergeant Cooper the way that he could read most people. As much as he wanted to scream, no, he kept his cool. I'm afraid he was a bit clumsy, sir. Dr. Clark looked quite serious. Gentlemen, I don't want to tell you how to do your jobs, but we have a situation here. Had this been a normal presidency, we would have a protocol for this. I can assure you that the president is not going to make it. And even if he did, we all know that an android or a hybrid android cannot be president. We have no military that can step in and assist. We have no vice president. He looked at Austin and Philip, but I know how loyal the SMU are to President Paulson. Philip looked at Dr. Clark. Then why are you trusting us with this information? We could take you out like that. Philip snapped his fingers and continued speaking. Then the truth about Paulson would stay in the Black House. Austin looked at Dr. Clark. Your personal position, how did you not know that the president was an android? He looked amused. He looked at Austin's name badge. Lieutenant Miller. What I have is a title, not a job. Dr. Clark leaned against a chair. Dr. Paulo in California attended to all of the president's medical needs. I am just here for show. Dr. Clark took a deep breath. Now I know why he always refused for me to examine him. Mr. King looked at Dr. Clark. I knew something was off about him, but I had no idea that he was an android. Now what happens? Dr. Clark pulled out a chair, sat down, and rested his arm on the briefing table. He will not survive this. He looked at Philip, Austin, and Mr. King. Someone in this room most likely poisoned him. Philip looked at Dr. Clark. How do you poison an android? A complete android or even a hybrid android can be contaminated with a complicated computer virus that can shut down their system. Some may take minutes or hours, while others may take weeks or months to accomplish their task. And of course, hybrids can be any level of human, so a toxic substance or poison can kill the human part of them. Dr. Clark rubbed his eyes. Mr. King looked pale. President Paulson was writhing in pain and holding his stomach. Mr. King suddenly became quite pale. He asked me how he was feeling pain. Dr. Clark looked at Mr. King. Then maybe he is a hybrid. Although most hybrids that I know of have human skin, Paulson did not, which means that he is most likely a full android. Otherwise, the needle would have penetrated his skin. Philip pinched Austin's arm. Ouch! Austin looked at Philip and gave him a dirty look. He said most, Philip, and I am not an android, nor a hybrid. Austin looked over at Mr. King. We need to report this to Agent Fields and Agent Plum immediately. Austin looked at Dr. Clark. Tell me now, what are you going to report this as? Dr. Clark looked at the three men. A heart attack. I suggest that you three do the same. Mr. King looked at Austin and Philip. He seemed to be in shock. I need to say this. I suspect that Agent Plum is an android or hybrid android. I have been watching him for a while and he seems to have a lot of the same mannerisms as President Paulson. I don't know that for sure though. Mr. King closed his eyes for a moment. Austin looked at Mr. King. That could make him an extremely dangerous android if he is programmed to react to an attack against the president. Mr. King looked confused. Philip looked at Mr. King. I think what Austin is saying is that anyone who knows that Paulson is an android won't believe our little heart attack story. Mr. King nodded and plopped down in the nearest chair. Austin spoke up. We need to blindside Agent Plum and reprogram him. He looked at Dr. Clark. Do you know how to reprogram androids? Dr. Clark shook his head. That's not in my field of training. Austin smiled. I have an idea. Mr. King, I need a clean phone line. Can I trust you? Mr. King gave Austin a look that said, Are you kidding me? Austin almost laughed and thought, yeah, the guy saw me poison the president and still has not said a word about it. Mr. King pointed to the phone on the briefing table. Line 3 is clean. Austin made a quick phone call to the SMU facility in California. It was a brief conversation, but packed a big punch. Austin turned and looked at Dr. Clark. We need to keep this news from Agent Plum and Agent Fields when they get back. Mr. King looked at Austin. Well, we are in luck there. I heard Agent Fields say that they were gone until midday tomorrow. There was a knock on the door, and then the door slowly opened. It was Dr. Clark. He looked at the partially burnt examining table that was missing a big chunk, and then looked at Dr. Paulo and the others. What happened to President Paulson? Austin answered, He self-destructed. The next morning, Austin woke up early and went to check on Sayers. He knocked on his door. "It's Lieutenant Austin Miller, sir." A moment later, Sayers opened the door. "Good morning, Lieutenant Miller. Come in." Austin smiled. "I hope that you slept well, sir." Sayers looked around the grotesquely decorated room that had belonged to President Paulson. The walls were painted light gray and the carpet was black. The bed was round and shaped, and it was covered with a gold and red circus-looking bedspread. Sayers looked at Austin. "I think that I would have slept a little better, sans the artwork, Lieutenant." Austin looked at the paintings on the wall and nodded. "Those would definitely give me nightmares." Austin looked at Sayers. "By lunchtime, you should not have to wear that mask ever again. We are going to say that Paulson had a heart attack in his office this morning. Mr. King will be there with you to assist you with anything that you need and to call Dr. Clark, who will declare President Paulson officially dead. I am sorry that I cannot give you exact time, sir. We are waiting for 2 agents to return and we need to take care of something. I will come and get you as soon as I can and we will put this plan into action." Dr. Paulo briefly examined Agent Fields first. He appears to be fully human. Before anyone could say anything, the doctor continued, "Just checking to be safe." Next, he pushed Agent Plum's eyelids up and examined his eyes. He pulled on his hair and looked in Agent Plum's ears. Dr. Paulo opened his black bag, which he had set on the counter, and took out a scanner. He turned on the power and scanned Agent Plum from head to toe. He waited while the scanner did its analysis. Dr. Paulo watched the screen. He looked at Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. "Just as I suspected, Plum is a level 2 hybrid android." Everyone looked horrified. "Now what do we do?" Frank said. "Well, to destroy him would be murder, since he has a mostly human anatomy." "Why don't we just reprogram him the way that we did Corporal Faith?" Frank asked. Dr. Paulo nodded. "A good suggestion, Agent Fisher." Frank looked at Agent Plum, who seemed to be coming to. Agent Plum was awake. Dr. Paulo spoke softly. "Agent Plum, how are you doing?" "Where am I? What happened?" Agent Plum tried to sit up but wasn't able to. He tried to lift his arms, but they would not move. He was too out of it still to realize that he had been tied down. He looked at Dr. Paulo. "Dr. Paulo, what's going on?" Dr. Paulo reached in his bag and took out a small vial and a syringe. Austin took a step forward. He had a flashback to the vial and the drops that he had put into President Paulson's coffee. Dr. Paulo looked at Austin. "Relax, Agent Miller. This will not harm Agent Plum. This will help him to relax." Austin nodded, and he and Sergeant Cooper and Frank took a step closer and stood around Agent Plum. Agent Plum looked at them, and then at Dr. Paulo, who was about to inject something into his arm. Agent Plum finally realized that he was tied down and pulled hard on his restraints. "Relax, Agent Plum. We are here to help you." "We'll see," Dr. Paulo spoke reassuringly. Agent Plum looked at the syringe. "What is that?" "Just a little something to help you relax. It will not harm your system." Agent Plum struggled with the bonds that held him down to the table to no avail. Frank had never seen Agent Plum come unnerved like that before, even when he had to physically fight a man off the president one time. Frank took another step forward. "Come on, Mike," Frank said. "You know Dr. Paulo. He won't do anything to hurt you." Agent Plum looked at Frank and nodded and relaxed. Dr. Paulo inserted the needle into Agent Plum's arm and administered the drug that would help him to relax. "You see, Agent Plum?" The doctor smiled. "That wasn't so bad." Agent Plum looked at Dr. Paulo. "What's this all about?" Agent Plum, "I don't know how to tell you this, so I will just come right out with it." Dr. Paulo held up the scanner and showed Agent Plum the screen. "You see this, Agent Plum?" Agent Plum nodded, and he looked at the picture graph of a body that showed it was a hybrid. "That's what's called a hybrid android." Agent Plum's speech slowed down as he spoke. "It shows which parts are android and what parts are human." Agent Plum's eyes started to close from drowsiness. Dr. Paulo looked at Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. "The Haberson is starting to work." Dr. Paulo waited a moment to speak again. He looked compassionately at Agent Plum. "This is a scan of your body, Agent Plum." Even though Agent Plum was in a semi-conscious state, he got a look of horror on his face and said as loudly as he could, "No, no, that is not true. I'm human, and nothing else." Tears welled up in Agent Plum's eyes and started rolling down his cheeks. He looked at Frank. Frank, tell him it's not true. Frank looked at Agent Plum. He felt sad for him. I'm sorry, Mike. It's true. Agent Plum looked into Frank's eyes for a moment with sadness and fear. What happens now? He turned his head and looked at Dr. Paolo. Dr. Paolo walked over to the counter and set the scanner down and then stood by Agent Plum's side. He laid his hand on his arm. You live life, just as you have been. Agent Plum seemed to relax quite a bit. He closed his eyes. I thought that you were going to destroy or kill me. Are you a danger to anyone, Agent Plum? Dr. Paolo asked. Agent Plum shook his head. No. Then I see no reason that you can't live a normal life. Dr. Paolo spoke encouragingly to Agent Plum. Agent Plum looked at Dr. Paolo. How can I have a normal life? How can I get married and have children and a family? Frank started to get choked up and discreetly turned and walked over to Agent Fields to check on him. He was still passed out. Frank took a deep breath. Dr. Paolo continued his conversation with Agent Plum. Here. Dr. Paolo went to the counter and picked up the scanner again. He went back to Agent Plum's side and held it up for him to see. You see here, Agent Plum? There are very little android parts in you. You are just less than an eighth of an android. You are the lowest level 2 android that I have seen. Agent Plum closed his eyes. Tears streamed heavily down his face. I don't want to be any android. Please take the android parts out, Doctor. Dr. Paolo looked at Austin and Sergeant Cooper and then back at Agent Plum. I can't. It would be too dangerous, and we would have to replace the parts with something. Agent Plum kept his eyes closed while tears continued down his face until the Haberson sedative helped him to fall asleep. Dr. Paolo turned the scanner off and put it back on the counter. He motioned to Austin and Sergeant Cooper. They walked past Frank, who was still standing by Agent Fields, and Dr. Paolo motioned to Frank to follow. Frank followed them to the table. He was very emotional over what he overheard and seeing Agent Plum in that state of mind. Austin and Sergeant Cooper were shaken as well. Dr. Paolo kept the volume of his voice low as he spoke to Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. I think the most compassionate thing is for me to erase his memory of this whole event. He will go back to thinking that he is fully human. Interim President Sayers started the press conference. My fellow Americans, it is with a heavy heart that I bring you the news that this morning President Earl Paulson suffered a heart attack during a meeting with his top aide. His personal physician, Dr. Jeremy Clark, and 2 House EMTs were unable to fully revive him. He was taken to the infirmary where he remained in a semi-comatose state until he had a second heart attack and died. President Earl Paulson was pronounced dead at exactly 11:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Sayers continued, due to the lack of stability in this country, I have enacted the DOAP 43 Act of 2028 that states, Sayers looked at the document that he was holding and read from it. If the President shall become ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out his duties as the President of the United States, and the Vice President is ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out or to temporarily take over the duties of acting or interim presidency, the President who most recently held office, if he is fit and able to assume the duties as interim President, he shall therefore assume full responsibility of all presidential duties immediately and until a special presidential election can be held. Sayers put the document back down on the desk. Interim President Sayers looked at the camera. I am asking each and every American to do their part in this dark time. I am sending a call out to all of the groups and the citizens that are fighting against one another to stop fighting. This is the United States. We need to all work together to stop the civil war that is ravaging our country and get back to the morals and standards that made our country what it is in the first place. Sayers looked right at the camera. My first act as interim president is to make void the LOTC, also known as the Law of the Constitution, that President Paulson enacted, and to re-establish the real United States Constitution. Sayers tore up a paper that was supposed to be a copy of the LOTC and looked back at the camera. I will now recite the preamble to the United States Constitution. President Sayers looked directly at the camera and spoke. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Mr. King said, I have Interim President Sayers on the phone. Austin said, thank you. I have Agent Fisher with me. Sayers was on the line. Greetings, Agent Lieutenant Miller and Special Agent Fisher. I hope that you both had a good flight. Yes, sir, we did, Frank answered. I'm calling you both because I want to invite you to be on my personal security team. Austin and Frank looked at each other. Frank smiled and nodded. Austin nodded back at Frank and smiled. Austin spoke first. I would be honored, sir. Frank answered, Agent Fisher here, sir. I would be honored as well. Very good. You both came very highly recommended by Dr. Powell, and Mr. King couldn't stop raving about you, Agent Miller. Austin stifled a laugh and looked at Frank before he answered. Thank you, sir. Would you like us to fly back today? Austin followed Jerome and sat down in the chair next to him. I need you to fly me out to California right away. Sure thing. To the SMU facility? Not quite. Agent Acosta looked at Austin. Is this for a mission? I want to fly out and get Sasha and bring her here for a few days. We are going to be married, and I am taking her to D.C. with me. Agent Acosta rubbed his chin, using a government plane for personal use. I like that. Sure thing. Count me in. Sasha looked at Austin and was speechless for a moment. Austin, you look really handsome in that uniform. Austin smiled. Thank you, Sasha. Do you need help with anything? Are you ready to go? I've got everything. Sasha looked over her shoulder and shouted, Okay, I'm leaving now. Who are you talking to? Asked Austin as he tried to peek through the open door to see who Sasha was talking to. Sasha looked at Austin. My roommate, Brenda. She still lives here? Austin asked, still trying to look. Yeah. Sasha put the suitcase down and yelled over her shoulder again, Brenda, come on out here so that Austin can see you, please. A red-haired woman in her 30s came to the front door. She was carrying a bowl of chocolate ice cream. Oh, hi, Austin. How have you been? I've been good, and you? The same. Hey, you two have a good time in Vegas. Brenda went back to the living room and sat down on the couch and continued watching a movie and eating her ice cream. Sasha picked up her suitcase. Are you happy? She looked at Austin and walked out of the apartment and closed the door behind her. There was a woman already sitting in the aisle seat. It was the blonde-haired woman that he had run into at the checkout counter. Frank did not want to be rude and climb over her, so he looked at her and asked, Would you mind terribly letting me through? Frank asked politely. Frank noticed that the woman had earbuds in and probably did not hear him. He was about to ask her again when the stewardess tapped him on the shoulder and said, Would you mind taking your seat, sir? We are about to take off. Frank nodded and looked at the blonde-haired woman that was seated. Now she had her head in a book in addition to the earbuds. Okay, lady, which do you want, my backside or my front side in your face? The woman looked up at him shocked. I beg your pardon? Frank's mouth dropped open. He pointed to her earbuds. She looked at him and pulled one earbud out. The music stopped.